I'm Sydney Bowles, and you're watching B News. Larry Warfield is a resident of Burlington, and he's also married to Town Clerk Amy Warfield. And in that capacity, he's been up close and personal with a lot of our local elections here in town. He's also interested in data, and so he started to wonder about what was going on with changes to voting after the pandemic, when a lot more people were voting early, voting by mail, voting early in the clerk's office. So he got out some Excel sheets, he did some analysis, and he came up with some really interesting findings. So we asked him here on to B News to talk to us more about it. Larry, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So let's start kind of back at the beginning. What possessed you to want to take this on?
Well, Amy was complaining this year, especially, that there was an astronomical amount of people that had sent in early voting applications. And I was wondering, well, is that unusual? How many of those people actually end up voting? Was it a waste of money or whatever? So I started to dig into that. And as I started to do that, I noticed different things in the data that I was going, oh, that's curious. Let me follow that trail until it petered out.
So you cover a lot of ground, and I want to get to it, but I think we should sort of establish some ground agreements here, some ground sort of conversational basics. I want to talk about privacy, and I want to talk about bias. So you're married to Amy Warfield, who's an elected official, and also in charge of elections, which is something where there is a lot of concern about bias and perspective. So how are you thinking about that? How are you making sure that none of this is sort of impacting sort of that nonpartisan aspect?
Yeah, so that's an important thing. One of the things that our family agreed to when Amy got elected was that we were going to be totally neutral. We do support candidates, we do vote, but we don't publicly support candidates. So all the information I was analyzing is information that is publicly available to everybody, including all the candidates. And basically I submitted public information requests. Pulling it all together raises a few sensitivities. Amy said it's okay for me to talk about what I found, but if a candidate's interested in the details of the people I identified or whatever, I can tell them the process, but they're going to have to do the legwork themselves.
No freebies here.
Yeah. Now in 2025, maybe that'll be a different story.
When Amy's no longer...
Yeah.
Okay, so the last piece is about privacy. You mentioned sort of identifying individuals. If I'm, a Burlington resident and a voter, what information of mine do you have? Do you know who I voted for? What do you know about me?
That's a really good question. The two sorts of pieces of information I used was the voter list, which is published and everybody is accessible to everybody, and it has an identifier, voter ID. And then for each election, there's a voter history, and all it records is the fact that you actually voted in that election. It just notes you and that you were voted and what the election was. Nothing about the candidates you voted for or anything like that. If it's a primary, it does say whether you took a Democrat, Republican ballot or whatever, but that's all that has. Okay,
so just to make sure I'm understanding, if I'm, say, Jane Smith, you know that I am a registered voter, you have a number that's associated with my name, you have confirmation that that voter number voted in 2024 and 2023, say.
Yeah.
And you have a tally of the total number of votes in that election. But you can't sort of necessarily go back and say, well, obviously Jane Smith voted for,
Yep.
Okay,
No
so
way.
we're on the same page. All right.
Yep.
So let's, do you want to get into the data?
Sure.
Okay, let's dig in. So we've got our trusty tech guy, Robert, there in the booth. Robert, can we go to the first slide? Okay, so your first finding here is that contested races drove election turnout. But because of early voting, your success in the election no longer depends on what happens on election day. So spell that out for me.
Yeah, so one of the first places I started was everybody thinks that the number of candidates on the ballot drives turnout. And I wanted to confirm that. Went back to 2016, looked at the key races. I just picked moderator, school committee, and select board. And the more candidates that had contested races, the larger the turnout was. There are a few races that maybe had one candidate, like the 2021 race with Morandi, Runyon, and Ellis was a very hotly contested, and had a larger turnout. But then the other thing I looked at was how many people voted early in each election. Mm-hmm. Early voting went into effect by law with the advent of COVID. Town elections aren't mandated to have early voting, but we've started with early voting. And 2020 is the first time. That was the big COVID year. In Burlington, we had in-person absentee voting in 2022, and since then we've been doing early voting, and you can see that the numbers, the light blue bars on this graphic, are the number of early voters, and it's building. In 2023, it was about half and half, and last year was 60% of the voters.
That's kind of amazing. I think, this is really a fascinating graph, right? You're seeing two pieces of information here. You're seeing that, broadly speaking, in local elections, and we should specify that this is only like April local Burlington elections, when there are more contested races, you tend to see more people turn out. And you're also seeing, essentially over time, an increase in the number of people who are voting early. Up till now, it's significantly more than half of people are voting ahead of Election Day. Yeah. So we're going to go to the next slide, because then you start to see the implication that this has, why this is important. This is a really complicated graph. You put a ton of work into this, Larry. So let's walk through this together. Basically what we're looking at is, there on the far side of the screen from me, you're looking at total votes cast, right? By the end of the election, almost 4,000 people had voted. And more than half of those had voted early, which means that a lot of people had already voted by the time candidates were sending out mailers, by the time, ourselves here at BCAT and Burlington Buzz had been doing sort of candidate profiles and that kind of thing. So, talk to me about that, the implication of this, why this matters. Yeah,
just a quick orientation. The black boxes on the bottom are all the media activities. The green boxes on top are the traditional campaign activities, and they're how I experienced them. So when I first saw a lawn sign, when I first got a mailer. So
there's some subjectivity here.
There's some subjectivity, speaking, when I received friends cards, whatever. And the red line is the important one, which is the rate that early voting ballots were started to receive back. All the early voting ballots were mailed on the 15th of March. The town clerk's office batches them all up and sends them all out at one time to avoid problems with calls with, well, my friend got one, but I haven't got mine yet. So. And within a week, we were already up to about almost 600 ballots. Now, when the total is 4,000, that's a significant number. And a lot of those people had already submitted their ballots before things like candidate profiles were available. So they must have been voting based upon name recognition or past history or whatever.
Right. I think there's so much that's raised by this graph, right? I think one thing that comes up is the implications for the media, and I want to talk about this in a minute. But I think the question here that I don't really think we can answer, but I think it is something to consider, is the fact that we can't know if having an additional 2 weeks of time to consider who they were going to vote for would have changed someone's vote, right? If I voted, on March 21st, my ballot arrived by March 24th, and I voted for, candidate A, B, and C, even if I had gone to the COA candidate forum, that doesn't necessarily mean that I would have changed my vote, right? But it does mean that candidates don't get to make their pitch in a certain way, people are voting on less information. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay.
You know, and you know, I feel it's our responsibility as voters to be as well informed as we can. So we need to get information from a variety of different sources. Past history, relationships matter a lot, but also, you know, what are the issues in town? What are the hot button issues, and how is each candidate going to? What's their approach towards that issue? What's their stance?
And theoretically, I mean, there's not a huge history of last-minute bombshell reveals here in Burlington. That's not typically the way our politics works. But theoretically, there could be some sort of revelation about a candidate, you know, a week before election that you know, then early voters wouldn't have the chance to factor in. So the other thing that I want to come back to is the media implication here. I'm a little biased. I am a member of the media, but this does also have implications for us. So talk about that.
Yeah. So. Basically, from a media point of view, it almost looks like you need to back up coverage probably by a week or so. Now, the challenging thing for the media is the date that the ballots get put into the mail is highly subjective. It's a function of two things. One is that the ballot doesn't close until something like mid-February, and then it has to get printed, generated. And then there's the time once they're actually received for all those early voting ballots. There's a whole big process that goes on to put them in envelopes, get them stamped, get them packaged, delivered. And there's a lot more there than what you would expect. You think you just fill out an application and they stick a ballot in the mail. But there's logging every step of the way. There's logging that you got it. There's logging that they sent it. There's logging that you got it back. And a large amount of time is spent doing those sorts of activities.
Okay. So for us, essentially, for those of us who are sort of attempting to get information out to folks, we need to bear in mind that, you know, we need to back up our timeline a little bit. Should we go to the next slide?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Actually,
okay. Can we go back, Robert? Awesome.
And it also says that candidates probably need to back up their activities also, if they're trying to get their message to people before they actually cast their ballots.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much information here for candidates. I think when we get to talking about age and precinct voting data, I think that's something that, if I'm running for town meeting, if I'm running for select board, that's the kind of thing that I really want to be paying attention to. So let's get there. But let's go to the next slide and talk about that first, because I think that's also some context here. Again, your data visualization skills, Larry, phenomenal. There's just so much information here. So let's walk through this. This is just going a little bit deeper into what you had before, right? So we're learning here that the majority of people who are voting early are voting by mail. And they're not necessarily sending their mail through the postal service. They're mostly using a mailed ballot and dropping it off in front of town hall. Is that right?
2/3 of the people send it, drop it off at town hall, and another third send it via the mail. If you want to make sure your ballot gets in on time, it's highly recommended that you drop it in the box in front of town hall. And if you put it in the mail, after the election was long dead and gone, I did actually got to access to the envelopes and checked postmarks versus when it was received. It averages about 3.5 days. And there was a significant number, 62 ballots were received after the deadline. So people put them in the mail, but they weren't received by the deadline, so their votes weren't counted. And that was more than the margin of error or the margin of victory in at least one of our races.
Right. I mean, this is really important. I think when you look at the dates that come on that ballot, or the dates that Amy is getting from the state in terms of when things need to be mailed by, it just looks way too close. It may be, you know, what the calculation is officially, but I think you really have to factor in a couple extra days for, you know, USPS does a great job, but, you know, it's real people and stuff happens. So I think, you kind of want to factor that in. And then just to talk about this piece over here, essentially what we're looking at here is the percentage of total early votes that had been received by a given date.
Yeah, and you can see that the three different colors are the gray are people who voted in person, and in-person early voting starts a little bit later, but that's in the clerk's office, and that tends to ramp as we get closer to election day. By mail, trails, and actually the most popular is actually at the town hall ballot box. And the funny story about that was Amy delivered all the ballots to the post office on that Friday the 15th, and actually got a call on the 16th saying, "Why is the ballot box not unlocked?" So somebody actually received it and actually cast their ballot that day.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, I guess just to pause for a minute here, I think the sense that I'm getting from having this conversation with you, Larry, is that there are so many possibilities for voters that are unlocked by early voting, vote by mail, and so many additional challenges for the town clerk's office, for the media, for candidates themselves that come with that. I think from a voter's perspective, it is really nice to be able to say, gosh, I don't know who I'm going to want to vote. I might as well get my ballot so that I can, if I want to, I can drop it off. But if I don't get around to it, I'll just show up in person. Or, maybe I'm driving through town one day and I just decide to stop by and vote in the clerk's office. That flexibility is nice, and it does, from a voter's perspective, it sort of lessens the pressure on a given election day. But it has these sort of downside impacts. Does it make you think differently about the overall calculus of that?
Yeah, it adds a whole new layer of complexity. Where elections used to be about a week's worth of activity, it's now about 6 weeks of intense activity.
Right. I mean, you see Amy come home at the end of the day, kick off her shoes, and tell you about all the work, right? So you sort of have this intimate perspective.
If I'm lucky, she comes home at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Or I see her.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And then there's a substantial cost, and all the labor that is going into operating this process is basically time that is not being spent doing other things that would normally get done in the clerk's office. In a year like this, where there are 4 elections, that's a good quarter to half of a year that's been tied up with the election process. It's tough to keep up on everything else. Right.
I mean, we can talk more about this later on, but I think I've heard Amy talk about before how you wouldn't think that, for one ballot, the effort of, opening the envelope, taking out the ballot, flattening it out, and scanning it, not a huge deal. But when there are thousands of them, it really adds up.
Yeah.
So, should we move on?
Yeah, let's move on.
Okay.
So.
Now we're getting really into the nitty-gritty of this data here. And this is stuff that if I was running for, say, school committee, I would be eating this up right now. So, all right, so we're going to dig into this. This is a lot of data. So let's start with the top line, and then we'll get into how you got there. Because effectively what you found is that seniors, people who are over 60, vote at much higher rates, and they vote much earlier. And the implication of that is that if you were trying to reach people who are likely to vote, or if you're specifically trying to reach seniors, you are really someone who needs to back up your timeline and get to those voters ahead of time so that you don't miss them, so that they don't vote before they get to know you. Yep. Is that right?
Definitely.
Okay.
Definitely.
Okay. So talk to me about how you got there, what you found.
So, and the way I went down this rabbit hole was everybody around town will say that seniors vote more than everybody else, but I said, well, how much more? So if you looked at the gray bars, that shows the percent of that age category that are registered voters.
So that's this gray bar here. So for people who are 70 and older, 23% of the registered voters turn out to vote. Is that right?
No, 23% of the registered voters in Burlington are 70 years old or older.
Wow, okay. So that's very disproportionate to the population.
Yeah,
Okay.
that would be an interesting thing to see
Yeah,
how disproportionate it is. But then, if you look at the top bars, that's the percentage that actually of the votes cast were cast by that age demographic. And seniors were almost a third, well, easily a third of all the votes cast. I'm sorry, seniors, 70-year-old, and were a third of all votes cast, and it's about 10%. 10% more seniors voted than were actually.
It's complicated. It's complicated.
Yeah,
There's a lot of.
So it's significantly more seniors voted than in proportion to how they're registered.
Right. I mean, when you add in folks who are in their 60s and 70s and above, you're basically getting up to, more than 50%, I think, if I'm doing my math right on the fly. And then you come over to this other graph here in blue and gray, and that's when the rubber hits the road, because what you're finding over here is that those voters that are disproportionately likely to vote, right? If something like half of voters are 60 and above, huge majorities of those voters, 59% of 60 to 70 or 60 to 69, and almost 80% of 70 above are voting early. That's massive.
Yeah. And for people looking at it, the bluish bars are early voting, and the lower lines, the gray, are the people that actually voted on election day. And you can see the staggering difference. In fact, there was only one age category, and I don't know why that is, but people that are 40 to 49 tended to vote in person.
And teenagers as well. I will say 18 and 19-year-olds.
Yeah.
So I had a theory on a couple of this, and I'll actually credit Nikki Cadillac of Burlington Buzz for this, because this was her idea, so I should make sure that she gets the credit for it. But I was thinking, all right, if I'm 18 or 19, it might be my first election.
Yeah.
There's a novelty to going to the polls in person, having that sort of patriotic experience. And then Nikki's contribution to this was, if you're 40 to 49, you might have young kids, and you want them to have that in-person experience. So I think that's a really smart way to think about what we're seeing here. But effectively, everyone else, whether we're looking at 20-year-olds, 30-year-olds, and 50-year-olds, 50-year-olds is right, basically 50-50, but those other age groups are really leaning heavily towards early voting.
Yeah, but if your demographic is, if the ideal demographic for your candidacy are seniors, you better get to them early because they're voting early. And if you don't, the boat is already sailed. Right.
I mean, it's interesting here, because I think there are so many pieces of our collective experience as a town that are collective across age groups. We share so many of our resources here and benefit from so many of the same services, but there are certain things that are more relevant for different age groups. I think particularly schools are something that seniors might feel the tax benefit of, but aren't necessarily personally experiencing the benefits of in that moment. So when I think about a school committee race, that's a really interesting way to think about the fact that it's disproportionately seniors who are voting. Do you make anything of that?
Everybody has their own vested interest. If and now reaching the senior demographic myself, tax sensitivity is high, so I have to balance that. What do you want to do for the schools versus what's that going to do for a tax bill?
Yeah.
Amy is still working, but I now appreciate friends that are retired, and when they say they're on a fixed income, how sensitive they are to it.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, I also can identify with the parents of children who want the best schools. They want the best resources available to their children. And as a senior, I look at that and say, well, that's my investment in the future. These are the people that are going to be, providing my medical care, running my nursing home, supervising my investments or whatever. It's important that they're well educated.
All right, should we move on to the next slide?
Sure.
Okay. So here, basically what you've done is you've broken this down, instead of by age, by precinct. So it's similar data, similar analysis, but different sort of categories here. So essentially, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like if we take the blue graphic here on, I don't know which, if I should face it or do this way, but the graphic towards you, on your side, every precinct is leaning pretty heavily towards early voting.
Correct.
What else do you take away from this?
Oh, the other thing is that's interesting is the turnout by precinct. Some precincts, first, the distribution of registered voters. Some of the precincts are more multifamily, more itinerant, not necessarily long-term residents, and they don't have as high a registration factor. But then you have a lot of precincts like Precinct 1, which has a lot of single-family homes. It's about 15% of the registered voters in Burlington, and they really have a vested interest, so they actually turn out in a greater proportion. So, and similarly, that happens in Precinct 6.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I think there's a call here, it sounds like, to find more ways to reach and connect to voters in, precincts 2 and 7, particularly, where the rates of voting are lower, the rates of registration are lower, but if there's a higher propensity of sort of apartment living of renters in those districts, those are still people and families that have an interest in the town and sort of deserve to be served by the community. Does that check out? Is that a fair thought?
It is a fair thought, and there are demographics that are embedded in like Precinct 7. If you got issues that are very pertinent to seniors, well, there are 3 assisted living facilities. Seven Springs has practically every friend of mine that sold their house moves into Seven Springs. There are a fair number of people that probably aren't being reached and maybe easy to tap. Too.
So again, we're going back to messages for candidates here, which is talk to seniors early, go to Seven Springs. Or, I'm being facetious, but essentially find places where those likely voters are likely to be, find ways that they're not being spoken to already, and get to them early.
Yep. So.
Okay. So let's keep on trucking. There's one more slide here that I think kind of culminates in a lot of what you're working on. Robert, can we move on here? Yeah. There's a lot here. This is really a lot, but it's basically what we've been covering, right? Actually, no. This one's a little bit different. This is talking about voter. Take it away.
So this slide came from. I'd done all this analysis and said, "Oh, that's really pretty interesting," and I now understand a bit about the landscape. I said, "Okay." Amy's run for elected office before, and she was only contested one time. And I said, if I was running a campaign resources are fixed both in terms of time and money. Where should I concentrate my efforts? I tried looking at the data several different ways, and the way that seemed to resonate the most with me is looking at how frequently you voted and when was the most recent time you voted. And that was quite enlightening and also revealed some surprises. The top green box is everybody who voted in 2023 and one or more 2023 and perhaps one or more elections. And that is half of the people who cast ballots last year voted in 2023. So low-hanging fruit, if I'm running a campaign, find those people, figure out how to contact them. If you expanded it to the 2 years, you get up to about 60%. And there were a couple of interesting things there. One was I started to go back and went back as far as 6 years, and there are a large number, almost a little over 1,000, what I call super voters, voters that have hit 5 out of 6 years. Assuming that somebody had to go on vacation or something, and there were over 500 that were 6 for 6. So if I was a candidate doing the legwork to find out who those people are, if you can get those on your side, you've got a head start.
So it's kind of a balance, right? I mean, you're saying that if I'm trying to get the most number of people aware of me as a candidate and interested in voting for me, talking to people who have voted in the most recent election is a good place to start. But here on the bottom here, we're also looking at new town voters, right? Yep. Almost 30% of voters in last year's local election were new. And I'll note again that those new voters were the most likely to vote early.
Yeah.
And those are going to be hard to reach because it's hard to target people who have no history on the rolls.
And that was the big surprise. You expected there were going to be people that are new, but 30% was, astronomical. And at first, I questioned whether it was due to the fact that, the Secretary of State sent out those little postcards for applying for early voting ballots. And there's a box that says all elections, and a lot of people check that and not realizing that included town election. So I started the question, well, maybe this is just something new this year. I went back and looked at 2023, then looked at 2022, and the distribution looks very similar from year to year. The percentages are different. And that's, to me, that's going to be a big challenge as a candidate, is how do you figure out who those people are? Are they just people that are close friends, relatives, contacts of, a particular candidate, or friends of people that are supporting candidates? Or is there some other dynamic going on here? And that's a mystery that I'd love to figure out, and I'm interested in theories that people have.
Yeah, I mean, it may be that some percentage of the population, likely wouldn't vote except, my neighbor's running this year. I know her, I like her, I'm going to show up and vote for her. And then the rest of the elections, they're not necessarily bothering. Yeah. But maybe the next time that candidate's up again, they'll turn back out. Yeah. Or it may just be that, life circumstances, there's stuff going on, you forget for a year or two. It's really difficult to suss out from simply data what that looks like. Yeah. But so Larry, this is really we've reached the end of your slides here, and there's just a tremendous amount of work that's gone into this. But I think it creates so many more questions, for me at least. And I think one of them is the question around the cost-benefit analysis of that early voting, right? You mentioned that the state sends out those postcards basically that say like what elections do you want to vote early. And I don't think people, when they're checking that, consider the cost, right? So we know that in the local election, there were about 4,000 ballots sent out to voters, right? That's ballots that someone in the clerk's office individually put in an envelope and mailed.
Actually put it in a computer, then printed out a report, stuck them, put together a whole package. It's not just a ballot and an envelope, a whole package, label it, record that they're going to send it out, put postage on it, send it out, and then have to sort of reverse that whole process on when it comes back. And
of those 4,000 that went out, only 2,300 roughly were returned. So that's, just over half. That's 57%. That's a lot of ballots, a lot of effort that went to sending ballots out that didn't come back. So from your perspective, as someone who's very close to the clerk's office, what are the implications of that for our town government?
The implications, I mean, it's a substantial cost. It puts an increased demand on the people in the office. And it really, especially in a year where you've got 4 elections, it it almost leads to burnout. In fact, many of Amy's peers as town clerks, after having gone through a presidential election, say, no, I'm not going to do another one. I'm retiring in 3 years, so I won't be doing it.
I mean, so to extrapolate a step further from that, I think I want to talk about the implications for me as a voter, right? We were talking earlier about the convenience factor of of checking that box and saying, well, I don't know, maybe I want to vote early. I'm not sure yet. And then I think from an individual perspective, that's a very tempting flexibility to have. But maybe am I right in sensing that the call of this, the conclusion that one might draw from this isn't necessarily don't vote early. It's think ahead. Are you really going to vote early? If so, definitely thumbs up, go for it. But if you are going to vote in person, don't ask the ballot. Is that about right?
That's about right. And if you think you want to vote early but you're not sure, don't put in a vote by mail application. Just show up at the clerk's office and vote in person. They're open Wednesday nights till 7 o'clock. Normal business hours the other days. You can just pop in. It's fast, it's convenient, and you're not wasting all that time and effort. So,
another question that this raised for me, and this might be something a question that I should ask candidates, right? If you may not be the person that I should be asking this question to, but I think a question that it raises for me is the level of sophistication that is required of a local school committee race or select board race. Is it changing? I mean, was it the case that 20, 40 years ago you could use these old-fashioned, not necessarily old-fashioned, but sort of like shoe leather tactics, knocking on doors, sending out mailers, and now it has to be different because of X, Y, and Z? Like, what are the implications of this in terms of how elections are changing, if that makes sense?
I think there are several different dynamics. First, technology, social media is changing the whole thing. So where there was a high dependence on mail, that's just one of the many ways to contact people. But as I mentioned before, as a candidate, your resources are finite. So you have to figure out where you're going to spend your time. In the past, it may have been easy to just grab a voter list and, who voted in the last election, send them out. Well, that may waste a lot. So who are the people, spending some time and figuring out who are the people that are most likely to want to support you and why will allow you can spend a little bit more time and narrow down so that you're spending your finite resources in the way that's going to have the greatest return.
Okay. Let's start to wrap this up. I think we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the increase in early voting, right? We learned that more than half, 61% of voters voted early in the 2024 local election. We learned that seniors vote at disproportionate rates and disproportionately early. We've learned that it's not equivalent across age groups and across precincts, and we've learned that the availability of early voting is likely scrambling who is voting in which years and what new voters are joining the ranks. That's a lot to take in. So give me your 10,000-foot summary, your final takeaways, the biggest lessons for you, both for our residents and for candidates, looking at the whole of this analysis.
Well, the first summary is everybody needs to start earlier. Unfortunately, if you're a candidate, you're going to have to get organized early, get your team in place early. You're going to have to start to do some of your work earlier than you would in the past. It used to be that you could intensively campaign for a month. Well, now it's going to be more than that. For the media, unfortunately, you're going to have to be, rounding up and doing those same sort of candidate profiles and interviews, but a whole lot earlier. It makes a challenge too, because then what are they going to be? What are the hot issues that really the election's going to be based on? for voters, you need to work at getting the information you need to understand who the candidates are and to make an informed vote, and to to determine whether are you going to show up on election day, and vote in person. Is the convenience factor worth more to you, and are you willing to burden the town with that? In which case, vote early. Yeah, and then for candidates, I think you can add a level of sophistication to your campaign. You're still going to have to, talk to people and, get your message out a variety of different ways. And just one of the ways is use the data and try to figure out, are there pockets of people that you should be talking to help get your message out so you can reach a larger audience of people that are more sympathetic to your message with less effort.
Well, Larry Warfield, this is just so fascinating. I'm really grateful that you took some time and that you did all this work. So thank you very much for coming on.
Oh, thank you for having me. It was sort of a labor of love, but you kind of wonder, does anybody care about it? So I'm glad I have the opportunity to share.
Yeah, I think it's, it's wonky. It's a lot to dig into, right? I think I spent a fair amount of time looking over the slides, just trying to understand them. And you and I talked previously as well, but I think that the takeaways here are really, really very fascinating, both just in terms of sort of the curiosity factor, but also for real takeaways for, like you said, for candidates, for voters, and for the media. So yeah. Larry Warfield, husband of Town Clerk Amy Warfield, an analyst of a significant body of data. Thank you very much. Once again, I'm Sydney Bowles. You're watching B News. Thanks for tuning in.